Jason Carter gripped his first-class ticket tightly, excitement bubbling in his chest. He had never flown alone before, and today was supposed to be a special moment, one his father had told him to embrace with confidence. But within seconds of stepping toward the first-class cabin, that excitement vanished. A sharp voice cut through the hum of boarding passengers. "Excuse me, young man," a flight attendant in a crisp Navy uniform said, stepping in front of him. Her name tag read Margaret Hayes, and her narrowed eyes swept over him disapprovingly. "First class is for paying passengers." Jason hesitated, confused. He had a ticket. Why was she stopping him? I have my seat here," he said politely, holding out his boarding pass. Margaret barely looked at it before shaking her head. "I don't think so." Around them, passengers started whispering. Some glanced over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Others looked away, pretending not to see. Jason's stomach tightened. He didn't understand what was happening. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that his father owned the airline. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. Jason Carter stood frozen in place, gripping his boarding pass as the murmurs around him grew louder. The flight attendant, Margaret Hayes, stood firm, her arms crossed, her expression neutral but with an undeniable edge of condescension in her gaze. The first-class cabin entrance loomed behind her, a world of luxury just out of his reach. Plush leather seats, glasses of freshly poured juice, and passengers already reclining in comfort. Jason had looked forward to experiencing it for the first time. Now, he wasn't even sure he would make it past the gate. "I already told you," Margaret said, lowering her voice slightly but keeping it sharp. "First class is reserved for paying passengers. Economy is that way." Jason's stomach tightened. Why was she saying that? His father had booked his IQ ticket just like anyone else. Did she think he couldn't afford it? "But I do have a ticket," he said, holding it up again. His voice was polite, controlled. His father always told him, "Respect is a reflection of your character, not theirs." Margaret exhaled, her patience thinning. "I don't want to embarrass you, young man, but I need you to step aside. You don't belong here." The words hit harder than he expected. His father had always assured him that he belonged anywhere he walked into, that if he carried himself with respect and dignity, the world would treat him the same. But right now, as people whispered and stared, he didn't feel like he belonged at all. Margaret had worked as a flight attendant for nearly 20 years. She had seen all kinds of passengers, business executives, celebrities, elite travelers, who barely acknowledged her presence. She prided herself on maintaining a first-class experience for those who, in her mind, had earned it. So when she saw Jason, a young black boy traveling alone, dressed neatly but not extravagantly, her first instinct was that he had made a mistake. A lost child trying to sneak into a section where he didn't belong. She had seen it before. Families booking cheap tickets and sending kids up to first class, hoping no one would notice. She wasn't about to let that happen on her watch. The contrast between Jason and the world around him was painfully clear. The first-class passengers sat comfortably in their cushioned seats, barely paying attention to the commotion. Some glanced over, their curiosity flickering for a moment before returning to their phones or newspapers. A middle-aged businessman adjusted his Rolex, casting Jason a quick glance before returning to his laptop. A woman with pearl earrings leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He shook his head slightly. Behind Jason, in the economy section, the line of passengers waiting to board stretched long. Impatient sighs filled the air, eyes flicking toward the delay up front. Jason could feel their eyes on him, burning through the back of his head. Margaret lifted her chin, standing tall under their gazes. She was doing her job. First class was for those who belonged. Margaret's assumptions clouded her judgment. She didn't notice the subtle flash of recognition in the eyes of one of the crew members as they glanced at Jason's last name on the boarding pass. She didn't realize that a man in a tailored suit, quietly observing from a distance, was about to change everything. She didn't know that Jason Carter was far from just another boy trying to sit in first class, and soon she was going to find out. Jason felt his face grow warm, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, confusion mixed with frustration. He had never been treated like this before. His father always told him to walk with confidence, to treat others with respect, and that the world would do the same in return. But at this moment, as the flight attendant continued to deny his place in first class, that belief started to crack. Margaret Hayes stood firm, hands on her hips, her polished uniform pristine as if she were guarding a VIP section rather than boarding passengers. The growing whispers from those around them didn't seem to faze her, and if anything, her gaze hardened. "Listen, young man," she said, lowering her voice as if doing him a favor. "There's no need to cause a scene. I don't know how you got this ticket, but I can assure you, first class is for passengers who belong here." Jason's fingers tightened around his boarding pass. "I do belong here," he said, his voice quieter than before but still steady. "My father booked this seat for me." Margaret let out a sharp breath, her exasperation barely concealed. "Oh, really? And where is this father of yours?" Jason blinked, caught off guard. He's not here. He's meeting me at my destination." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She had already decided. This boy didn't belong here. The travel industry had its fair share of tricks. People using fake upgrades, lost boarding passes, or claiming they deserved special treatment. She wasn't about to let someone take advantage of the system. "I'm sorry, but unless your guardian steps forward, I can't allow you to board first class," she said, her voice final. The low murmur of passengers continued. Some glanced at the confrontation and turned back to their newspapers. Others, however, watched with growing unease. A businessman in a tailored gray suit sitting near the entrance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been half listening to the exchange, but something about the way the boy's shoulders stiffened made him uneasy. The kid wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't raising his voice or making a fuss. So why was she treating him like he didn't belong? Jason's frustration built as he saw other passengers walk past him effortlessly, their tickets barely glanced at before they were waved through. A man with messy hair, dressed in casual jeans, handed over his boarding pass and was immediately let in. A young couple dressed in sweatpants and hoodies walked right by without a second glance from Margaret. Why was he different? Then, from behind him, came a voice. "This is ridiculous." Jason turned his head. An older black woman, dressed in a smart blazer and carrying a designer handbag, stepped forward. She had been watching quietly, but now her patience had worn thin. "You've barely looked at his ticket," the woman said, her voice calm but sharp. "Yet you're letting everyone else walk in without question. Care to explain why that is?" Margaret's expression flashed with something. Discomfort. Maybe even irritation. "Ma'am, I'm simply following protocol." "Protocol?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Since when does protocol mean treating a young black boy like a criminal while letting everyone else in without a second glance?" A ripple of tension spread through the passengers. More people were paying attention now, and Margaret seemed to notice. Jason felt his heart race. He wasn't used to people standing up for him. He had always been told to handle things respectfully, on his own. But right now, with an entire plane watching, he wasn't sure what to do. Margaret's lips thinned and she let out a controlled breath. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll check his ticket." She snatched it from Jason's hand and scanned it quickly. Her eyes widened, just for a split second before she masked her reaction. First class. Seat 2E. The ticket was real. Margaret's throat tightened. She had been so sure. She glanced at Jason again, but now, for the first time, there was hesitation in her eyes. Jason's fists clenched. He had done nothing wrong. So why did it still feel like he had to prove himself? The silence stretched. The first-class passengers watching waited for Margaret's response. But before she could speak, the businessman in the tailored suit, the one who had been watching, stood up from his seat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm. "I'd like to know why this young man is being interrogated over a valid first-class ticket." Margaret's posture stiffened, her authority slipping for the first time. Jason felt his chest tighten. More people were watching now. His heart pounded in his chest. Would she let him in? Would she continue to insist he didn't belong? And then, a new voice cut through the tension. Deep, commanding, familiar. "I'd like to know the answer to that as well." Jason turned, his breath catching. A man in a sharp, dark suit, with an air of authority, stepped toward them. His face was calm, unreadable. But Jason recognized him immediately. His father. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment Jason turned and saw his father, his heart pounded with both relief and anticipation. He hadn't expected him to be here, but as always, David Carter arrived at exactly the right moment. The hue, air in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been whispering suddenly fell silent. Even the businessman who had stood up a moment ago sat back down, recognizing the sudden power shift in the room. Margaret Hayes, however, remained frozen, her eyes flickering between Jason and the man who had just spoken. David Carter was a presence that commanded respect, not just because of his tailored dark suit and polished demeanor, but because of the confidence he carried. A self-made billionaire, the CEO of Carter Airways, and a man who built his empire from the ground up, he didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. "Is there a problem here?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. Margaret hesitated, the color draining slightly from her face. I was just ensuring proper protocol, sir," she said, her voice suddenly much softer. "This young man claimed to have a first-class ticket, and I needed to confirm his eligibility." Jason's hands clenched at his sides. Eligibility? He had presented his ticket twice, yet Margaret had questioned him as if he were trying to sneak in. David's sharp gaze fell on her. "So, you assumed my son didn't belong here?" Margaret stammered, struggling to recover. No, sir, it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that," the older black woman from earlier interrupted, standing up from her seat. "I've been watching the entire time. You barely glanced at that boy's ticket before telling him to leave. Meanwhile, you let..." Multiple other passengers walk by without a second thought. A murmur of agreement swept through the first-class cabin. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the ugliness of what had just happened. David exhaled, keeping his composure. He had dealt with situations like this before, people who judged others by appearance rather than merit. But what made his jaw tighten now wasn't just the discrimination. It was the fact that his son had to experience it firsthand. Turning to Jason, he placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, son?" Jason nodded but didn't speak. Something inside him felt different now. He had grown up knowing his father's status, but his father had always raised him to be humble, to earn respect by his actions, not by his wealth. Today, however, he realized that sometimes people didn't care about your character. They judged you the moment they saw you. David straightened and looked at Margaret once more. "Let's be clear," he said. "Jason Carter has every right to be in first class, not just because he has a valid ticket, but because, whether you like it or not, he is a paying passenger like everyone else." Margaret swallowed hard. "Sir, I truly didn't." David raised a hand, silencing her. "If you had checked his ticket properly the first time, we wouldn't be having this conversation." His voice remained measured, but the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. "Instead, you embarrassed a child in front of a plane full of people. You assumed that because of the way he looked, he didn't belong." Margaret's breathing quickened. She had been caught, and worse, she realized now. This was her boss. Passengers watched in silence, some looking guilty for not stepping in sooner. The businessman in the tailored suit, the woman in pearls, the couple who had whispered. It was clear now that they regretted their silence. David took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Margaret to hear. "Tell me, Ms. Hayes," he said, "do you believe someone like you belongs in first class more than my son?" Margaret's lips trembled. No, sir. I want an honest answer." Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor. "No, sir." David studied her for a moment longer before stepping back. He turned to the flight captain who had come forward after hearing the commotion. "Captain, I expect my son to be treated with the same respect as any other passenger in first class. If that cannot be guaranteed, I have no problem ensuring changes are made." The captain nodded quickly. "Understood, Mr. Carter. Jason, please take your seat. We sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Jason hesitated for a second before stepping past Margaret, who remained stiff, her face pale. He walked down the aisle, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on him. But this time he didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He took his rightful seat in 2A, gripping the armrest as the realization of what had just happened fully sank in. His father had handled it without raising his voice, without anger. But the impact of his words had been louder than any outburst could have been. As David turned to leave the plane, he stopped beside Margaret one last time. "Respect," he said quietly, "is something you show to all passengers, not just the ones you assume deserve it." Margaret barely nodded, her throat too tight to respond. David glanced back at Jason, offering him a small nod. Jason nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. This was a lesson neither of them would forget. As the first-class passengers settled in, the tension in the cabin slowly began to ease. But for Margaret, the confrontation would replay in her mind long after the flight had landed. And for Jason, this was the moment that changed everything. The last of the first-class passengers settled into their seats. Jason finally exhaled, the tension in his chest slowly loosening. He adjusted his seatbelt, but his mind replayed the scene over and over. The doubt in Margaret's eyes, the way she had barely looked at his ticket, the way she had assumed he didn't belong. His father's words had settled the matter in public, but deep inside, Jason knew this wasn't just about a ticket. It was about something much bigger. Margaret stood near the entrance of the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the cuffs of her uniform. She had been working for this airline for years, and never once had she found herself in such a humiliating situation. The realization that the boy she had so confidently dismissed was not just another passenger, but the son of the CEO left her, shaken. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was enforcing the rules, until David Carter had exposed her bias for the entire plane to see. She stole a quick glance at Jason, who sat quietly in his seat, staring out the window. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't even looked at her after taking his rightful place in first class. Somehow, that made it worse. A quiet voice snapped her from her thoughts. "Ms. Hayes, the captain wants to see you," one of the junior flight attendants said hesitantly. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she nodded and hurried toward the cockpit. When she stepped inside, she found the captain standing with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Close the door," he said. Margaret did as instructed, bracing herself. The captain studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know who David Carter is?" Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers tightening against her uniform. "Yes, sir." "And do you know how he built this airline?" Margaret hesitated. "I know he's successful, sir. He started as a janitor at an airport." The captain interrupted. "Worked his way up, became a pilot, then an executive, and now he owns one of the biggest airline companies in the world." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had never heard that before. The captain continued. "He built this airline on respect, on making sure that every passenger, regardless of where they come from, gets treated with dignity. And today, you failed that principle." Margaret's throat felt tight. She wanted to defend herself, to say it was just a mistake, but she knew that wasn't true. She had made an assumption the moment she saw Jason, and now there was no way to take it back. The captain let out a slow breath. "Mr. Carter didn't request that you be fired," he said finally, "but I need you to understand something. You didn't just embarrass a passenger today, you embarrassed the airline, and if something like this happens again, there won't be a conversation. You'll be gone." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood, sir." The captain nodded toward the door. "Now, get back to work." Margaret turned and stepped out of the cockpit, her mind spinning. As she walked back through the cabin, she avoided Jason's gaze. But inside, something shifted. For the first time, she questioned how many other times she had let her bias affect her judgment without realizing it. Meanwhile, Jason sat in his seat, still staring at the clouds outside. He had spent his whole life being taught to believe that the world was fair, that if he worked hard and treated people with respect, he would be treated the same. But today, he had learned that sometimes that wasn't enough. He glanced toward his father, who was standing near the gate, watching through the glass window. David Carter didn't have to say anything. His presence alone was a reminder that strength wasn't just about power. It was about how you used it. Jason's fingers unclenched from the armrest. He wasn't angry anymore. He was determined. One day, he would make sure no one else ever felt the way he did today. Jason continued staring out of the airplane window, watching the clouds drift below him. His mind was no longer occupied with the excitement of his first solo flight. Instead, it replayed the events of the past hour, the way Margaret had looked at him, the disbelief in her eyes when she saw his ticket, the way his father had calmly handled everything. A part of him still felt that lingering unease, the realization that this wasn't just about a mistake. It was about how people saw him before they even knew him. Margaret moved through the aisle, handing out drinks to first-class passengers. She hadn't spoken to Jason since the incident, nor had she looked in his direction. He wasn't sure if it was out of embarrassment or avoidance, but he could sense a shift in her demeanor. She was quieter now, more deliberate with each interaction, as if suddenly aware that her actions had weight. A businessman sitting across from Jason cleared his throat and leaned in slightly. "Hey, kid," he said in a low voice. "That was something back there. Your dad. He handled that well." Jason looked over, surprised. The man, dressed in an expensive suit, seemed thoughtful rather than condescending. "Yeah," Jason said after a pause. "He did," the man nodded. "You know, I travel all the time. First class, business meetings, you name it. And I've seen stuff like that happen before. Maybe not always so publicly, but it happens. People make assumptions." He took a sip of his drink before continuing. "But the way your dad stepped in, he didn't just put her in her place, he taught her something. That's real power." Jason absorbed those words. He had been too caught up in his own emotions to fully grasp it before, but the businessman was right. His father had not yelled, had not embarrassed Margaret the way she had embarrassed him. Instead, he had made her face her actions and their consequences. That was the kind of strength that mattered. As the flight continued, Margaret finally gathered the courage to approach Jason. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice lacking its previous authority. I just wanted to apologize. I made an assumption about you that I shouldn't have." Jason looked at her, unsure of what to say. Part of him wanted to accept it and move on. But another part wondered if this apology came only because she had found out who his father was. Would she have felt the same regret if Jason had been just another kid flying alone? He didn't know, and maybe he never would. But what he did know was that this wasn't just about him. "Okay," Jason finally said. His voice was even, not bitter, not angry, just steady. "But next time, maybe don't wait until someone calls you out to treat people the way they deserve to be treated." Margaret's face flushed and she nodded, clearly understanding the weight of his words. "You're right," she admitted. "I'll do better." Jason gave a small nod and turned back toward the window, letting that be the end of it. The apology mattered, but what mattered more was what she would do with it. By the time the plane landed, Jason had made a decision. He wouldn't let this moment define him negatively. Instead, he would use it as a lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had seen firsthand what power looked like when used the right way, and one day he would make sure he used his own influence to do the same. As he stepped off the plane, his father was already waiting for him. David Carter smiled and ruffled Jason's hair before asking, "How was the flight?" Jason thought about everything. The confrontation, the passengers who stayed silent, the businessman's words, Margaret's apology. Then he thought about his father, standing tall, commanding respect not because of his wealth, but because of his character. "It was an experience," Jason finally said. David chuckled. That's one way to put it. Jason walked beside his father through the airport, a newfound determination settling inside him. This was only the beginning. As Jason and his father walked through the airport, the weight of what had happened lingered in the back of his mind. He had boarded the plane excited about his first-class experience, but he had walked off it with a deeper understanding of the world. He had always believed that treating people with kindness and respect was enough, but today he had learned that some people judged before they even knew you. And sometimes it took more than just politeness. It took courage to demand the respect you deserved. David Carter noticed the thoughtful expression on his son's face and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. "It wasn't fair what happened, but you stood tall. And that's what matters." Jason nodded, his grip tightening on his backpack strap. I don't get why people think like that." His father sighed, his gaze steady. "Some people see the world through a narrow lens, but that's not an excuse to accept it. We change things by showing them a better way, by holding people accountable, by standing our ground, and by never letting anyone make us feel small." Jason let those words settle in. He had seen firsthand the power of standing up, not with anger, not with shouting, but with confidence and dignity. That was what his father had done, and one day, Jason would do the same. Jason's story is one that many people face, often in silence. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever witnessed someone else being treated unfairly? If this story resonated with you, share it, because awareness is the first step to change. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. See you in the next one.